Noah Lancaster stood frozen in the doorway of his own guest bedroom, watching his wife Aubrey arch beneath another manna client, whose penthouse she'd just finished designing. The crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor like his 30-year marriage. The Lancaster name meant something in Beverly Hills. Noah had built his empire one luxury property at a time, transforming empty lots into architectural marvels that graced magazine covers and commanded 8-figure price tags. At 45, he was the golden boy of high-end real estate, the man who could sell a mansion before the foundation was poured. But success had a price, and that price was time he'd thought he could make up for later, time that had created the void Aubrey now filled with other men. Aubrey Lancaster moved through their Malibu estate like a queen surveying her domain. At 36, she possessed the kind of effortless elegance that made other women hate her and men follow her. With hungry eyes, her interior design firm, Aubrey Interiors, was the most sought after in the city. She had an uncanny ability to read people, to understand their deepest desires and reflect them back in silk wallpaper and Italian marble. What Noah didn't realize was that this talent extended far beyond home decoration. Their marriage had started as a fairy tale. Noah, the ambitious young developer, and Aubrey, the art student with dreams bigger than her trust fund. They'd built their life like one of Noah's houses, carefully planned, beautifully executed, and hollow at the center. The early years had been different. They'd stayed up all night planning their future, making love on construction sites under starlit skies, believing they were building something that would last forever. But success changed things. Noah's projects grew larger, more complex, demanding longer hours and constant travel. Aubrey's own career blossomed, attracting wealthy clients who appreciated her sophisticated taste and undivided attention. The couple that once shared everything began living parallel lives, intersecting only at charity galas and family photographs. The first crack in their foundation appeared 3 years ago. Noah had returned early from a site inspection to find Aubrey's car gone and her phone off. When she returned hours later, perfectly composed with a story about a client emergency, something in her eyes had shifted. She was still his Aubrey, beautiful, intelligent, devoted, but there was a distance that hadn't existed before. He'd dismissed it as paranoia, the result of too much stress and too little sleep. After all, Aubrey was everything he'd ever wanted in a wife. She managed their social calendar with military precision, turned their home into a showpiece that impressed even the most jaded Hollywood elite, and played the role of devoted spouse. At every industry event, she was perfect, perhaps too perfect. The second crack came 18 months later when he'd noticed charges on their credit card for a hotel where Aubrey claimed to have had a business lunch. When he'd casually mentioned it, she'd burst into tears, accusing him of not trusting her, of being so consumed with work that he'd forgotten how to love. The fight had lasted 3 days, ending only when she'd suffered what appeared to be a panic attack so severe that he'd driven her to the emergency room himself. Dr. Patricia Mendez had been treating couples for over 2 decades, but the Lancasters presented a particularly complex case. Noah sat rigidly in the leather chair, his jaw clenched with the kind of tension that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Aubrey, meanwhile, seemed to melt into her seat, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face as she spoke of feeling neglected and misunderstood. "Noah works constantly," Aubrey whispered, her voice breaking at just the right moment. "Sometimes I feel like I'm married to a ghost. He leaves before I wake up, comes home after I've gone to bed. I'm so lonely, Patricia. I just want my husband back." Noah felt the familiar stab of guilt pierce his chest. He'd heard these words before, in various forms, and each time they felt like accusations carved into his bones. He watched his wife dab at her eyes with a tissue, noting how she managed to cry without smudging her mascara, a skill he'd never seen her possess. During their early years together, "I know I work too much," Noah admitted, his voice heavy with resignation, "but everything I do is for us. The new development in Brentwood, the commercial project downtown, it's also we can have the life we dreamed of. But what's the point of having everything if we have nothing together?" Aubrey's question hung in the air like expensive perfume, beautiful and suffocating. Dr. Mendez scribbled notes. occasionally nodding with practiced empathy. She'd seen this dynamic countless times, the successful husband drowning in guilt, the beautiful wife wielding vulnerability like a weapon. But something about Aubrey Lancaster troubled her. The tears came too easily, the emotional responses too perfectly timed. In her experience, genuine pain was messier, less choreographed. After the session, Noah walked Aubrey to her car, his arm around her waist in a gesture that felt more protective than intimate. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "I'll try to be home more. Maybe we could take that trip to Tuscany you've been wanting." Aubrey smiled, the expression transforming her face from tragic to radiant in an instant. "I'd love that. But first, I have to finish the Morrison project. Richard has been so patient with all the delays." Richard Morrison. Noah knew the name, a pharmaceutical executive recently divorced, known for his appreciation of beautiful things, the kind of man who collected art, cars, and women with equal enthusiasm. The kind of man Noah might have been in another life. That evening, while Noah worked late in his study, Aubrey stood in their bedroom applying the final touches to her makeup. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Can't wait to see the finished bedroom. Hope you'll give me a private tour of all your design choices." She smiled, the expression cold and calculating. Richard Morrison was easy prey, wealthy, lonely, and desperate to prove his virility after his wife's very public affair. He would wine her, dine her, and shower her with gifts, all while believing he was seducing her. Men like Richard never realized they were being hunted until it was far too late. The truth was that Aubrey had perfected the art of emotional manipulation over years of practice. She studied her targets like an architect studies blueprints, learning their weaknesses, their desires, their fears. Noah's weakness was guilt, his need to be the provider, the protector, the perfect husband. Richard's weakness was his ego, his need to be desired by a woman who seemed unattainable. But as she prepared to leave for another client meeting, Aubrey caught sight of herself in the mirror. For just a moment, she saw past the perfect makeup and designer clothes to something darker underneath. She quickly looked away. After all, glass houses required constant maintenance, and she couldn't afford to let even the smallest crack show. Richard Morrison's penthouse overlooked the city like a modern-day castle, all floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist luxury. Aubrey moved through this space with practiced ease, discussing color palettes and furniture placement while her fingers traced along his arm with seemingly innocent touches. She'd been working on his project for 6 months now, each meeting carefully orchestrated to build tension and desire. "The bedroom needs something more intimate," she murmured, leading him toward the master suite. "A space should reflect the person who inhabits it. Tell me, Richard, what makes you feel most alive?" Richard's answer came in the form of hands on her waist, lips against her neck, the fumbling desperation of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be wanted. Aubrey responded with perfectly calculated passion, hormones timed to his movements, her body arching in all the right places. She'd performed this dance so many times it had become second nature. But Richard was just one name in what Aubrey privately called her client portfolio. There was Marcus Chen, the tech mogul whose smart home system she'd designed, while systematically accessing his personal files for insider trading information. David Rothstein, the art dealer who'd gifted her a Picasso sketch in exchange for services that had nothing to do with interior design. James Wellington, the media executive who'd fast-tracked her firm's publicity campaigns after their weekend in Napa. Each man believed he was special, that he'd awakened something in her that her husband couldn't. The truth was far more clinical. Aubrey collected lovers like she collected rare artifacts, not for emotional satisfaction, but for the power they represented. Every affair was a calculated investment. Every secret shared was currency to be spent later. The methodology was always the same. First, she would study them during initial consultations, identifying their emotional vulnerabilities and material desires. Then came the slow seduction, lingering touches during design presentations, intimate dinners disguised as business meetings, carefully timed moments of seeming vulnerability that made them feel like protectors and conquerors simultaneously. The manipulation extended beyond sex. She'd learned that men like these craved the feeling of being needed by someone who appeared to need nothing. So she would share carefully crafted stories of her loneliness, her artistic frustrations, her complicated marriage to a man who was wonderful but distant. They would comfort her, advise her, and inevitably offer her things: money, connections, inside information, expensive gifts that she would reluctantly accept after just enough protest to maintain the illusion of her integrity. Noah, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the business that his wife conducted in the shadows of their marriage. He saw the gifts she claimed were from grateful clients, the late nights she attributed to demanding projects, the emotional distance she blamed on his own unavailability. When he questioned anything, she had perfected the art of turning his suspicions back on himself, making him feel guilty for doubting her dedication to their relationship. "You don't trust me," she would say, tears welling in her eyes. "After everything we've built together, you think I would betray you? How can we have a marriage without trust, Noah? How can I design beautiful spaces for other people when my own home feels like a prison of suspicion?" The panic attacks were her masterstroke dramatic episodes that would send Noah into protective mode, erasing all questions and replacing them with concern for her well-being. She'd research the symptoms carefully, practice the hyperventilation and the trembling until they looked completely authentic. The emergency room visits served dual purposes. They convinced Noah of her fragility while providing medical documentation of her condition. But maintaining multiple relationships required careful scheduling and meticulous attention to detail. Each man had to feel prioritized while remaining compartmentalized. She kept separate phones, separate email accounts, separate versions of herself for each relationship. The Aubrey who cried in therapy with Noah was different from the Aubrey who whispered seductive promises to Richard, who was different from the Aubrey who played intellectual equal with Marcus. During their philosophical discussions about technology and human connection, as she left Richard's penthouse that evening, Aubrey felt the familiar rush of successful manipulation. He'd just agreed to recommend her firm to 3 of his business associates, each of whom represented potential new projects and new opportunities. Her phone buzzed with a text from Noah. "Home late again tonight. There's dinner in the fridge. Love you." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford, a weakness that would compromise the careful architecture of deception she'd spent years constructing. After all, in her experience, love was just another word people used to justify their need to possess and control each other. She preferred the honesty of transactions, the clarity of mutual exploitation disguised as mutual desire. The private investigator's report landed on Noah's desk like a bomb disguised as paperwork. Margaret Voss had been in the business long enough to deliver bad news with clinical detachment, but even she seemed shaken by the scope of Aubrey Lancaster's deceptions. Photographs, financial records, hotel receipts, phone records, a comprehensive catalog of infidelity that spanned 3 years and involved at least 7 different men. Noah stared at a photograph of his wife leaving the chateau, Marmont with Marcus Chen, her hand intimately placed on his chest, her face animated with laughter he hadn't seen directed at him in months. The timestamp showed it was taken on their wedding anniversary, the same night she'd claimed to be suffering from a migraine. "There's more," Margaret said quietly, sliding another folder across his mahogany desk. "The financial irregularities. She's been receiving gifts, cash payments, and investment tips that she's never declared. The Picasso in your living room? It was a gift from David Rothstein after she spent a weekend with him in Santa Barbara. The surprise remodel of your guest house last year, funded by insider information she obtained from James Wellington." Noah's hands trembled as he opened the second folder. Bank statements showed deposits that Aubrey had hidden in separate accounts. Credit card receipts revealed purchases for lingerie he'd never seen, jewelry she'd never worn around him, hotel rooms booked for times when she'd claimed to be at work. The woman he'd married was a stranger, and the stranger had been systematically dismantling their life while he'd been building his empire. "How long have you suspected?" Margaret asked, her voice gentle despite the brutality of the evidence she'd compiled. "Part of me always knew something was wrong," Noah admitted, his voice hollow. "But I convinced myself it was my fault. The long hours, the travel, the pressure of success. I thought if I just worked harder, made more money, gave her more of everything she wanted, It would fix whatever was broken between us. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his career building dream homes for other people while his own house of cards collapsed. Around him, every foundation he'd poured, every frame he'd erected, every detail he'd obsessed over in his professional life had been an attempt to create the stability and security he'd failed to maintain in his personal life. That evening, Noah sat in his study nursing a scotch and staring at architectural plans for his latest project, a sprawling mansion in Bel Air that would house a family he envied for their apparent happiness. The house featured an open floor plan, walls of glass that let in natural light, and sight lines that connected every room to the central living space. Transparency and connection, everything his own marriage lacked. Aubrey found him there at midnight, still dressed from what she'd claimed was a client dinner, but which Noah now knew had been an evening with Richard Morrison. She moved behind his chair and placed her hands on his shoulders, her touch feeling like a violation now that he knew where those hands had been. "You're working too late again," she said, her voice carrying the practiced concern he now recognized as performance. "Come to bed. We both have early meetings tomorrow." Noah didn't move, couldn't move. The weight of her deception felt crushing, but beneath it was something even worse, the realization that he'd been complicit in his own betrayal. Every time he'd chosen work over conversation, every time he'd accepted her explanations without question, every time he'd allowed guilt to override his instincts, he'd enabled the destruction of their marriage. "The Morrison project is going well?" he asked, testing the waters of her deception. "Challenging, but rewarding," she replied smoothly. "Richard has very specific tastes. He wants everything to be perfect, which means a lot of late nights and weekend meetings, but I think he'll be pleased with the final result." The casual way she lied to his face was perhaps more devastating than the affairs themselves. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no recognition that she was speaking to the man who'd loved her for 15 years. She delivered falsehoods with the same ease that she might have discussed the weather, and Noah realized that this level of deception required not just practice, but a fundamental absence of empathy. "I love you," she said, leaning down to kiss his forehead before heading toward the stairs. The words that had once warmed his heart now felt like ice water in his veins, because Noah was beginning to understand that Aubrey Lancaster was incapable of love in any real sense. She could perform it, manipulate it, weaponize it, but she couldn't feel it, and that made her far more dangerous than a simple cheating spouse. That made her a predator who'd been hunting in their home for years while he'd been building walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the real threat was already inside. Noah's plan was methodical, executed with the same precision he brought to his most complex construction projects. He would give Aubrey enough rope to hang herself, document her lies so thoroughly that even her considerable skills at manipulation couldn't overcome the evidence. The hidden cameras were installed by the same security company that protected his construction sites, positioned with architectural precision to capture every angle of their home. For 2 weeks, he watched his wife prepare for her betrayals like an actress preparing for a role. He observed her select different perfumes for different men, practice expressions in the mirror, rehearse stories she would tell him later to explain her absences. The woman he'd married was revealed to be a master craftsman of deception, and her medium was human emotion. The recordings were devastating in their intimacy. He watched her performance with Richard Morrison, the way she gasped his name, declared her feelings, promised him things she'd once promised only to Noah. But it was the conversations afterward that truly broke him. As Richard lay spent beside her, she would check her phone with cold efficiency, already mentally scheduling her next encounter while he spoke of leaving his ex-wife for her. "You know, I can't leave Noah right now," she would say, her voice perfectly calibrated to sound tortured by the impossibility of their situation. "The business, the assets, it's all tied up together. But someday, when the time is right, we'll have everything we want." It was the same script she used with all of them, the same promises delivered with the same breathless sincerity. Each man believed he was the love of her life, the one she would choose if only circumstances were different. None of them realized they were merely different instruments in the same symphony of exploitation. The night Noah finally confronted her, Aubrey had returned from what she'd claimed was an emergency meeting with a client whose project had been delayed by permit issues. In reality, the cameras had recorded her arrival at the Beverly Hills Hotel, where she'd spent 3 hours with David Rothstein, discussing the acquisition of another piece of art for their collection, though Noah understood now that the collection was entirely fictional, a story designed to explain the expensive gifts she received in exchange for her services. "How was your emergency meeting?" Noah asked when she entered their bedroom. His voice carefully neutral. "Exhausting," she replied, beginning her nightly ritual of removing jewelry and makeup. Some people have no understanding of how complex these projects can be. They want everything perfect, but they want it yesterday. Noah activated the television in their bedroom, but instead of the evening news, security footage filled the screen. Aubrey, frozen in the act of removing her earrings, watched herself enter the hotel lobby, her hand intimately linked with David's, her face animated with laughter and desire. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Noah had imagined this moment countless times, had prepared speeches and accusations, had practiced the cold delivery of evidence that would strip away her ability to lie. But now, faced with the reality of confrontation, he felt only a profound sadness. "How long have you known?" Aubrey asked finally, her voice containing no shame, no apology, only a kind of clinical curiosity. "Long enough to understand that our entire marriage has been a performance," Noah replied. "The question is, was any of it real, even in the beginning?" Aubrey sat on the edge of their bed, her perfect composure finally cracking slightly. For a moment, Noah thought he might see genuine emotion, real remorse, some fragment of the woman he'd fallen in love with. Instead, what he saw was calculation, her mind working through options, scenarios, damage control strategies. "You think you're innocent in this," she said, her voice taking on the familiar edge of manipulation. "You abandoned our marriage years ago, Noah. You chose work over us, success over connection. I was drowning in loneliness while you built your empire. These men, they saw me, they valued me, they made me feel like I mattered." Even now, caught in undeniable evidence of her betrayals, she was attempting to shift blame, to make him responsible for her choices. Noah realized that this was perhaps her greatest talent, the ability to take any situation and remake it so that she was simultaneously the victim and the hero of her own story. "I see you now," Noah said quietly. "Maybe for the first time, I really see you." And he did. Behind the perfect makeup and designer clothes, beyond the practiced expressions and rehearsed emotions, he saw someone who had never learned to love anything except the power that came from being loved. She collected devotion like other people, collected art not for its beauty or meaning, but for its market value. She was, he realized, completely empty at her core, a beautiful facade with no foundation. A house built entirely of glass, with nothing inside but shadows and carefully arranged mirrors. The confrontation continued until dawn, but it was really over in those first moments of recognition. Noah understood that Aubrey Lancaster was incapable of the kind of honesty or growth that might save their marriage. She was a predator by nature, and predators didn't change, they simply found new hunting grounds. The divorce proceedings were swift by Beverly Hills standards, but brutal in their thoroughness. Margaret Voss's evidence proved invaluable in court. Though Aubrey's legal team fought viciously to minimize her exposure, she'd underestimated Noah's capacity for strategic thinking, had assumed that his guilt and love would protect her even after discovery. The prenuptial agreement she'd once dismissed as unnecessary became her salvation and her downfall. While it protected Noah's business assets, it also limited her ability to claim the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to maintaining through her extramarital enterprises. Noah moved into a penthouse apartment downtown, a space he designed himself with clean lines and honest materials, steel, concrete, and glass that revealed rather than concealed. From his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the construction sites that represented his legitimate empire, buildings that would outlast the broken promises and false intimacies that had defined his marriage. Aubrey, meanwhile, found herself in an uncomfortable position. Richard Morrison had ended their relationship upon learning he was one of many. Marcus Chen, David Rothstein, and the others had similarly distanced themselves once the scope of her deceptions became clear. Her client base dwindled. As word spread through the interconnected world of Beverly Hills elite, the woman who had built her life on being desired discovered that desire based on deception was fragile, easily destroyed by truth. 6 months after their divorce was finalized, Noah encountered Aubrey at a charity gala they'd once attended together as the golden couple of luxury real estate. She looked immaculate as always, but there was something different about her, a hardness around her eyes, a brittleness to her smile that suggested the mask was becoming more difficult to maintain. "Hello, Noah," she said, approaching him during the cocktail hour with the confidence of someone who believed she could still manipulate any situation to her advantage. "Aubrey," he replied, noting how other guests seemed to give them a wide berth, as if infidelity might be contagious. "I heard about the Malibu project," she said, referring to his latest development, a series of sustainable homes designed for families seeking authentic connection to their environment. "It sounds lovely, simple, honest." There was something in her tone that suggested she understood the implicit criticism of everything their life together had represented. Noah had built his career creating elaborate fantasies for other people, but his new work focused on homes that prioritized function over facade, connection over impression. "I've learned to appreciate transparency," he replied. "Buildings that are what they appear to be, relationships that are based on truth rather than performance." Aubrey's smile faltered slightly, and for just a moment, Noah thought he saw something genuine in her expression, perhaps regret or recognition of what she'd lost through her choices. But then the mask was back in place, perfect and impenetrable. "I hope you're happy," she said, and Noah realized she meant it in the way that people hope for things they themselves can never have. "I'm learning to be," he replied, which was the most honest thing either of them had said to each other in years. As he watched her walk away, Noah reflected on the complexity of their shared destruction. Aubrey was indeed a master manipulator, a woman who had built her life on the exploitation of others' emotions. But she was also, in her own way, a victim not of Noah's neglect or society's expectations, but of her own inability to form genuine connections with other human beings. She was trapped in a glass house of her own construction, surrounded by reflections, but never truly seen, seeing others only as resources to be harvested rather than people to be loved. The tragedy wasn't just that she had destroyed their marriage, but that she was constitutionally incapable of building anything real to replace it. She would move from relationship to relationship, leaving destruction in her wake, not because she enjoyed causing pain, but because she literally didn't understand the difference between love and leverage, between intimacy and manipulation. Noah, meanwhile, had learned that building a life required the same principles as building a house: a solid foundation, honest materials, and the courage to let natural light expose both the beauty and the flaws. He was older now, scarred by the experience of loving someone who couldn't love him back, but he was also free in a way he hadn't been in years. The glass house they'd built together had shattered completely, but from its ruins, Noah was learning to construct something real, not perfect, but genuine. And perhaps that was the most important lesson their marriage had taught him, that the most beautiful homes were not those without flaws, but those where the flaws were acknowledged, accepted, and incorporated into the design. As he left the gala that night, Noah looked up at the city lights reflecting off the glass towers that defined the Los Angeles skyline. Each light represented a life, a story, a choice between authenticity and performance. He thought about Aubrey, still trapped in her glass house, still performing love for audiences who were becoming increasingly skeptical of her show. And he wondered, when someone spends their entire life perfecting the art of deception, do they eventually lose the ability to recognize truth even when it's offered freely? Can a person become so skilled at manipulation that they forget what genuine emotion feels like? Or do they simply choose performance because it feels safer than the vulnerability required for real connection? What do you think? Was Aubrey a master manipulator who consciously chose to exploit others? Or was she a damaged person who had lost the ability to form authentic relationships? In a world where so much of our lives are performed on social media and in professional settings, How do we maintain the difference between genuine connection and calculated presentation? And perhaps most importantly, once trust is broken so completely, is redemption possible, or are some people simply too damaged by their own choices to ever love or be loved authentically?